we're about to step deep into the harsh and unforgiving world of medieval warfare. Forget what you've seen in movies and fairy tales. Life as a knight was anything but noble or easy. Behind the shining armor and tales of chivalry lay brutal training, endless wars, suffocating duty, and a life haunted by violence and fear. Could you survive even a single day in their world? Could you endure the crushing weight of honor and steel? Get comfortable, but stay alert. This story will reveal the brutal truth few ever knew. Before we begin, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let us know where in the world you're watching from in the comments below. Let's dive into the untold reality of the medieval knight. The year is 1250, deep in the heart of medieval Europe. Imagine you are not yet a knight, but a boy of noble birth. From the moment you drew your first breath, your future was already decided. You would become a knight, or perish trying. Knighthood was not for the faint-hearted, nor was it romantic or glamorous, as poets later sang. For those destined for the sword, childhood ended almost as soon as it began. By the age of 7, you would leave the warmth of your mother's arms and be sent to another lord's castle as a page. This was the first brutal step in a lifelong journey. As a page, your days were harsh and rigid. Dawn broke early, and the tasks began before the sun had fully crested the hills. You learned manners, certainly, how to serve at table, how to carry messages, but far more critical was obedience. Pages were whipped if they misbehaved. No softness was tolerated. You were expected to respect authority unquestionably, for this discipline would later be vital on deadly battlefields. Between chores, you trained. You practiced swordsmanship with wooden weapons heavier than real ones, designed to strengthen young muscles. You learned to ride, not for pleasure but for survival. Falling from a horse during a charge could mean instant death. Hours were spent learning how to handle a lance, shield, and dagger. Pages wrestled one another, honing reflexes and toughness. Even play was rough and dangerous, no place for the timid. By 14, if you endured, you were promoted to squire. It sounded like advancement, but the brutality intensified. As a squire, you were assigned to a knight, serving him in every possible way. You cleaned his armor, tended his horse, dressed him for battle, and stood beside him during bloody combat. You were his shadow, absorbing lessons through experience and proximity. If you failed him, punishment was swift and merciless. And the training continued. Squires practiced daily in the quinton, a brutal exercise involving riding at a spinning target that struck back with a heavy weight if missed or hit poorly. They ran obstacle courses in full armor, learned to climb walls, and trained with live blades. Bruises, broken bones, and even deaths during training were common and accepted as necessary sacrifices to forge a warrior. Fear was deliberately instilled and then forced out of you. A squire was taught to face terrifying situations with stoic determination. To flinch at the sight of death or hesitate in the face of danger was unacceptable. Chivalry, the knightly code, was discussed in theory, but in practice, brute force and unwavering loyalty to one's lord were paramount. The final trial came when the knight deemed the squire ready, though readiness was a relative term. Some were dubbed knights at 20, others older, but almost all had been tested in real battle by then. Ceremonies varied, but the essence remained. You knelt, vulnerable, while the lord struck you lightly with a sword, the accolade, symbolically marking the end of your submission and the beginning of your new life as a knight. But new life was a generous term. Knighthood was not a reward. It was a sentence to a life of duty and danger. You were now a professional killer bound to his lord and cause. Your days would be dictated by bloodshed, endless campaigns, and a fragile honor system that could cost you your life in an instant. The brutal truth? For knights, the journey to glory was paved with pain, fear, and sacrifice. And for many, it was only just beginning. Becoming a knight might have been an honor, but every day in armor was a burden, literally and figuratively. Once knighted, you were expected to embody strength, courage, and readiness at all times. That meant wearing armor often, even outside of war, and mastering its unforgiving weight. By the High Middle Ages, A full suit of plate armor weighed anywhere between 45 and 55 pounds, 20 to 25 kilograms. While it was ingeniously designed to distribute the load evenly across the body, the strain was real. Knights needed tremendous stamina just to function. Wearing armor in combat was exhausting. Imagine standing under the hot sun or trudging through muddy fields while essentially encased in a steel coffin. Every movement was deliberate and slow. Heat built up quickly, and dehydration was a constant risk. There were no water bottles on the battlefield. Even before fighting began, mounting your warhorse was a task requiring strength and help from squires or comrades. Once in the saddle, however, you became a force to be reckoned with. Medieval horses bred for knights, destriers, were large, powerful beasts capable of carrying both you and your heavy equipment. Still, riding was brutal on its own. Hours in the saddle wore down even the toughest warriors. Chafing, bruises, and muscle cramps were unavoidable. And then came battle. The battlefield was chaos incarnate. Knights fought in brutal melees where finesse often gave way to brute strength. Weapons like maces and war hammers were specifically designed to crush armor. Even the best steel plates offered no guarantee. A direct hit could dent your armor inward, turning your own protective shell into a cage of broken ribs and punctured organs. Vision was another challenge. The visor of a helmet provided limited sight lines, especially when lowered for protection. Peripheral vision was almost non-existent. Hearing was muffled. Many knights described the eerie sensation of fighting in near silence, with only the pounding of their own heartbeat and the clash of steel breaking through. Fatigue was as deadly as enemy swords. Fights could last for hours, especially during sieges or prolonged engagements. Knights who collapsed from exhaustion or heat stroke often never got back up. Falling down in armor was perilous. While it was possible to rise again, the risk of being swarmed and stabbed through gaps in your armor was high. In some cases, immobilized knights simply suffocated or were trampled to death by friend and foe alike. Armor, despite its weight and restrictions, did save lives. But it also came at a price. Bruises and concussions were common after every engagement. Knights frequently suffered from chronic pain in their joints and backs after years of fighting. There were no physical therapists in medieval times. Injuries accumulated until they became debilitating. And war was constant. Contrary to romanticized tales, knights were not only called upon for noble duels or epic crusades. They were also sent on raiding missions, sieges, and brutal peasant-suppressing expeditions. Most warfare involved attacking villages, defending castles, and enduring long, miserable marches through inhospitable terrain. Victory rarely felt like triumph. Survivors would return home physically broken and mentally scarred, their bodies battered from the inside out. The camaraderie of fellow knights was one of the few consolations, but bonds forged in blood could be fleeting in the brutal, treacherous world of medieval politics and war. So while armor symbolized power, in practice it was an unforgiving master. The shining plate that marked you as elite in the eyes of the world became your prison, slowly wearing you down battle after battle, year after year. Knighthood was not only about grand battles on open fields. In truth, much of a knight's brutal existence was spent in the cruel and exhausting reality of siege warfare. Castles were the heart of medieval power, and attacking or defending them was a deadly business that could stretch on for weeks, even months. Imagine standing guard on the ramparts as a defender, day after day, in freezing rain or blistering heat. Sleep came in snatches, interrupted by alarms and assaults. Archers rained arrows on the besiegers below, but the enemy did not relent. They built siege towers, trebuchets, and battering rams. Each crash against the gate reverberated through the walls, and through you. Supplies quickly became a knight's nightmare. Inside a besieged castle, food ran short. Knights who once dined on meat and bread now ate rats, dogs, or anything that could be found. Disease often broke out in the cramped, filthy conditions. Dysentery, typhoid, and infections claimed lives as swiftly as enemy blades. Filth piled up, morale broke down, and still the knights stood firm, because surrender often meant slaughter. But attacking a castle was no better. Sieging knights slept in tents in muddy fields, exposed to the elements. They endured arrows, boiling oil, and rocks hurled from defenders above. Nights were long and restless, haunted by ambushes and sudden sorties. Wounds festered quickly in dirty camp conditions. Surgeons, if available, relied on brutal methods, amputations without anesthesia, cauterization with hot irons, or simply letting wounds rot if nothing could be done. Knights, bound by duty and hardened by necessity, adapted to this grim existence. They led assaults on walls and scaled ladders under a storm of missiles, knowing many would never reach the top. If they breached the defenses, another horror awaited them, the sack. Victory in a siege was rarely merciful. Knights often unleashed their fury and frustration upon the defenders and townsfolk. Killing, pillaging, and brutal punishments were common. Prisoners might be ransomed if they were noble, but commoners faced death or slavery. It was a harsh reality shaped by custom and the raw thirst for spoils. Knights fought not only for duty but for wealth, and sieges offered rich plunder. Between major campaigns, a knight's life remained restless. Feudal obligations meant constant readiness. Lords demanded service whenever war broke out, often with little notice. Sometimes knights fought for their king, other times, they waged private wars over land, honor, or revenge. These skirmishes were no less deadly than great battles. Even in peace, violence simmered beneath the surface. Tournaments, often romanticized today, were brutal contests that served as preparation for real combat. Early medieval tournaments were no games, they were chaotic melee brawls involving dozens of knights. Deaths were common. Competitors wielded blunt weapons, but the force behind each blow was very real. A shattered helmet or a crushed rib was a badge of honor, or a ticket to an early grave. The code of chivalry, so often idealized, did little to restrain the savage instincts of the time. While knights were expected to be loyal, courageous, and protect the weak, these virtues applied mostly to fellow nobles. Commoners rarely saw mercy. Raids on peasant villages, forced labor, and brutal taxation were part of a knight's duty to his lord. Mercy was a luxury that few could afford in a world ruled by power and survival. For knights, violence was not an exception. It was life. From sieges to skirmishes to tournaments, bloodshed shaped every corner of their brutal existence. Death loomed ever present, and only the strongest, most ruthless, and luckiest survived to tell their tales. A knight's brutality did not end on the battlefield. Off the field of war, life did not suddenly become peaceful or easy. In fact, for many, the moments between battles brought a different kind of torment, one that wore down the spirit more than any sword. Knights lived by a strict code of duty, which governed their every action. Though chivalry is often portrayed as gallant and noble, in reality it was suffocating. Knights were sworn to their lords, bound by oaths that could not be broken without severe consequences. Their time was never truly their own. Even during rare moments of calm, they were expected to train, oversee their lands, and manage disputes on behalf of their lord or king. In theory, chivalry required knights to be courteous, protect the weak, and honor women. But the truth was far more complex. These ideals mostly applied within the noble class. Toward peasants and enemies, knights often displayed ruthless pragmatism. Peasant uprisings were crushed mercilessly, and laws were enforced with brutal punishments. The very people knights were meant to protect often lived in fear of them. And then there was isolation. Despite constant interaction with other knights and lords, true companionship was rare. Marriage was often arranged for political advantage, and love was not guaranteed. Long campaigns meant years away from family. Letters took months to travel, if they arrived at all. It was not uncommon for knights to return home only to find children grown or loved ones dead. The emotional toll was immense. Warriors were expected to show no weakness, but grief, guilt, and trauma followed many of them. The horrors of war, mutilated comrades, scorched villages, and the screams of the dying haunted their dreams. There was no understanding of psychological wounds back then. No healer could mend a shattered mind. Knights often turned to faith for comfort. Medieval Europe was deeply religious, and knights were no exception. They attended Mass daily when possible, confessed sins, and participated in religious festivals. Some went on pilgrimages or fought in crusades, believing they could atone for the violence they had wrought. Yet even faith brought anxiety. The Church taught that killing was a sin, even in war. Knights lived with the knowledge that, despite their justifications, their actions could damn them. The contradiction was ever present. A knight could die believing he had served his lord well, yet still face eternal punishment. This fear gnawed at many, especially as death approached. When knights grew old, if they lived long enough, a new kind of brutality awaited them. Years of combat left their bodies broken. Arthritis, chronic pain, missing limbs, and blindness from head injuries were common. There was no retirement in a modern sense. Some became castle commanders or advisors, but many simply faded away, their reputations slowly forgotten. Some knights sought redemption later in life. They donated to monasteries, founded churches, or even became monks themselves in search of peace. For them, the transition from bloodshed to contemplation was jarring. The silence of the cloister could never fully erase the echoes of the battlefield. In the end, the life of a knight was not endless glory, but relentless struggle. Duty weighed heavily upon them. Their world demanded violence and obedience, leaving little room for kindness or peace. Every wound, every lost comrade, every sleepless night carved scars deeper than armor could ever hide. It was a brutal life, not only in body but in soul. The life of a knight was shaped by duty and brutality, but how did it end? Not always with honor, and almost never with peace. The brutal truth was that even after surviving countless battles, a knight's final days were often as harsh as his youth. Some met death in violent ways. The battlefield spared few. Younger, more ambitious knights replaced the veterans. Those who grew old still fought, driven by oaths and expectations, but slower reflexes and accumulated injuries made them vulnerable. Armor could only protect so much. Falls from horses, crushing blows, or simply being overwhelmed by numbers spelled doom. There was no noble escape from this reality. Dying in battle may have been seen as glorious, but in truth, it was often ugly, painful, and lonely. Others returned home, but they too faced brutal fates. The medieval world was not kind to the elderly. A knight's worth was measured by his strength and ability to serve. When that faded, so too did the respect of peers and lords. Without land or wealth, an aging knight could find himself destitute. Veterans unable to provide for themselves sometimes ended up begging, reliant on the charity of monasteries or former comrades. The songs of glory did not feed empty stomachs. Some knights, however, secured wealth and land through warfare and loyalty to their lords. These few spent their later years managing estates, holding court, and enforcing laws, often harshly. Peasants and tenants were still at the mercy of their knightly overlords, and brutality did not soften with age. The violence of the sword gave way to the cruelty of taxation and punishment. For the lower classes, even retired knights could be ruthless masters. The lucky and pious sought spiritual redemption in their final years. Many became patrons of churches and monasteries, hoping donations would cleanse their sins. Some even took holy vows, exchanging swords for prayer. The stark contrast between their violent past and humble monastic life was glaring. Still, the fear of damnation haunted them. Medieval belief was clear: violence, even when justified, risked eternal punishment. A lifetime of killing, no matter how dutiful, weighed heavily on aging souls. Legacy mattered deeply to knights. Heraldry, family honor, and tales of valor were preserved in song, tapestry, and chronicle. Sons were raised to follow the same brutal path. Yet as generations passed, even the most celebrated knights became footnotes in history. Time, ever merciless, eroded reputations just as surely as it weathered stone castles. By the later Middle Ages, the world began to change. Gunpowder weapons emerged, challenging the supremacy of plate armor. The knightly charge, once unstoppable, faltered against disciplined ranks of infantry and cannons. Warfare evolved, and knights began to lose their dominance. Some adapted, serving as commanders or elite cavalry. Others clung to old ways, only to find themselves obsolete. The brutal life they endured was slowly replaced by new forms of violence, less personal, but no less deadly. Despite their decline, knights left a permanent imprint on history and culture. Their deeds, real and exaggerated, inspired countless legends. Medieval romances, epic poems, and later, Renaissance and Victorian revivals transformed them into symbols of honor and virtue. The brutal, bloody truth of their daily existence faded behind a veil of myth. But behind every romanticized image of a noble knight stood a man who had endured unimaginable hardships. A man who had killed and nearly been killed countless times. A man who had lived with constant fear, crushing duty, and little room for softness or mercy. Could you have done it? Could you have faced a world of endless war, carried crushing armor into brutal battles, enforced harsh laws, and endured the slow, painful decline that awaited every aging knight? History does not ask, it only remembers. And it remembers that for knights, life was not a fairy tale. It was harsh. It was violent. It was brutal. So, could you have done it? Could you have endured endless battles, crushing armor, and the unforgiving code that ruled every knight's life? Few today could survive the brutal reality these warriors faced daily. Yet through pain and sacrifice, they shaped history, leaving behind legends built on hardship, not fairy tales. If this story opened your eyes to the darker side of medieval life, don't forget to subscribe, hit the bell icon, and share this video with friends who love history as much as you do. Drop a comment below. What part of the knight's life surprised you the most? Thanks for watching and being part of this journey into the raw and ruthless past.